Okay. Welcome everyone. My name is Hannes Kerber, and I welcome you on behalf of Boston College to this webinar on Leo Strauss's interpretation of Plato's Symposium. Allow me to begin this event on a very sad note. During the night from Wednesday to Thursday this week, Christopher Bruell passed away. Chris was one of the most remarkable men of his generation. I say this with great confidence, despite or maybe even because I unfortunately never had the chance to meet Chris in person. There are many others, including many others in this audience, who can, and I'm sure will soon speak about his achievements as a thinker, as an author, and at least as a teacher with more competence than I can do here and now. But from my peculiar perspective, as someone who unfortunately never encountered Chris face to face, but who is now part of the world that he inhabited, I can confidently say Christopher Bruell's deep and lasting impact on everyone around him is simply astonishing and a testament to the truly exceptional life that he lived. For those in the audience who might hear Christopher Bruell's name today for the first time, let me at least mention the titles of his two majestic studies of Plato and Aristotle. On the one hand, on the Socratic education, an introduction to to the shorter Platonic dialogues, and on the other hand, Aristotle as teacher, his introduction to a philosophical science. These books are astonishingly rich and rewarding, but maybe for some of you, an easier place to start is the place where I started to learn about and, more importantly, from Christopher Bruell, is a short essay he wrote entitled The Question of Nature and the Thought of Leo Strauss. It was published in 2011 in a French journal called Clezes and is now on the internet. But soon there will be something even better, because next year this essay, together with 17 other essays by Chris, 3 of which are unpublished, will be collected in a volume entitled Essays of 5 Decades on Philosophy and Philosophers, edited by Eric Buzzetti and Devin Stauffer. However, Chris's legacy is not just in the words that he wrote, but also in the seminars that he taught, in the lectures he gave, and in the lives he touched. I cannot count the number of articles and books and translations I've read inspired by him. And everywhere I turn, I encounter his truly impressive students. And finally, I'm fortunate enough to now teach in a department that he shaped like no one else and that owes its vitality, its seriousness, and its impressive intellectual passion first and foremost to him. In almost every conversation here at Boston College, I feel Chris's influence. There's no doubt in my mind that Chris's legacy will continue to inspire us, whether we got to know him directly or through his profound contributions to our understanding of the philosophers he wrote about. I know I speak for many here when I say that our thoughts are with his family and with his friends. Now let me make a hard turn, a turn that is not easy for many of us, but I think that is in the spirit of Christopher Bruell. And let's start with our event, and let's discuss Plato's Symposium. And let me introduce the 3 panelists. The first one is Svetozar Minkov. Svetozar Minkov is a professor of philosophy at Roosevelt University in Chicago, and he's the president of the Leo Strauss Foundation. Zarko has asked me to introduce him by doing what Plato did to Socrates, that is, by making him young and beautiful. Obviously, this task goes beyond the limits of my and really of anyone's rhetorical abilities. So instead, I will just mention his study of Francis Bacon's inquiry touching human nature, and also list his many contributions to the serious study of Leo Strauss. But before I say a word about Zarko's books, let me say 2 words about the Leo Strauss Foundation, because the foundation has kindly agreed to pick up the tab for today's event. The Leo Strauss Foundation continues and expands the study and dissemination of Strauss's work and thought, And if I haven't miscounted, today is the third event sponsored by the Strauss Foundation in the last 2 years, and I know that at least 2 more events are being planned as we speak. But back to Zarko, whose contributions to Strauss studies are at least partially the inspiration for and recently also the result of the work of the Strauss Foundation. Zarko is not only the author of Strauss on Science, Thoughts on the Relation between Natural Science and Political Philosophy, but he's also the co-translator of Strauss's early unpublished study of Hobbes's Critique of Religion, and he's the co-editor of the volumes Towards Natural Right and History, Essays and Lectures by Leo Strauss, 1936 to 1947, Leo Strauss on Plato's Euthyphro, the 1948 notebook, Leo Strauss's published but uncollected writings came out just a few weeks ago, as well as Leo Strauss on religion, writings and interpretations, the recent interpretation of which provides us with the occasion to get together today. What is more, Zarko has more publications in his pipeline than most of us can manage to publish in a lifetime. Among other things, he's currently preparing the publication of Strauss's correspondences with Seth Bernadetti. He's doing that together with Rana Berger, who's also in the audience today, and with Paul Krauss. Welcome, Zarko. Our second participant panelist is Rasoul Namazi. Rasoul is an associate professor of political theory at Kunshan University in China, as well as an assistant professor of practice at Duke University here in the US. His 2022 book, Leo Strauss and the Islamic Political Thought, offers the first in-depth study of Strauss's writings on Islamic political thought and received the prestigious Delba Winthrop Award for Excellence in Political Science. Rasoul's most recent publication is, as I already mentioned, once the occasion for our gathering today. Rasoul and Zarko are co-editors of Leo Strauss on Religion, Writings and Interpretations, which came out with SUNY Press this year. In a minute, Rasoul will tell us more about the book, but I should mention that the book first came out as a sturdy but somewhat prohibitively priced library copy, and that an affordable paperback version will be published next year. Welcome, Rasoul. Last, but by no means least, allow me to introduce Alex Priou. Alex is an associate professor of political philosophy at the University of Austin, and one of the chief culprits of the indispensable New Thinkery podcast. Alex is the author of 3 books on Plato. In 2018, he published Becoming Socrates on the Parmenides. In 2023, he published Defending Socrates on the trilogy of the Theaetetus, the Sophist, and the Statesman. But then, instead of doing what would be right and just, he did not finish his trilogy by publishing a book entitled Killing Socrates, but instead Alex published most recently and most relevantly Musings on Plato's Symposium. Welcome, Alex. Join me in welcoming this group. And gentlemen, I look forward to your presentations and the following discussion, during which we will also give our audience the opportunity to ask questions. Rasoul will start, Zarko will follow, and Alex, you will conclude, and then we'll do a discussion on the panel, and then at the end we'll add audience questions. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannes, for this very generous presentation. So generous that you just gave me a promotion, making me an associate professor, while I am only a lowly assistant professor of political theory at Duke Kunshan University. But it's always nice to hear that. I would like to thank you personally for moderating this event, obviously, and also thank Leo Strauss Foundation for making this event possible. And obviously, I would like to thank all the attendees for being here and listening to our talk. I would like to just give you some information about the background of the book that just came out, meaning Leo Strauss on Religion, Writings and Interpretation. This volume, I can say, is a part of a project that Svetozar, Minkov and I have been pursuing for some years now, independently of each other and also together. And that is to make available and published a specific category of writing by Leo Strauss. These writings in this category have, in general, two specific characteristics. One of the characteristics of these writings is that they are mostly written for private use. So Strauss wrote these transcripts that we have included in this volume mostly for himself. They are mostly reading notes. When he was reading some specific book, he took notes. Also lecture notes and also class preparation notes. So therefore they are very laconic, very telegraphic, difficult to understand and fully connect with his other writings. So that is the first characteristic of these writings that we have published. And the second characteristic of these writings is that they are often, but not always, often about subjects on which Strauss did not publish anything substantial during his lifetime. So for instance, we have transcripts about Pascal, about Lessing, on which Strauss didn't publish on, which makes these transcripts quite valuable. Quite valuable for understanding Strauss's thought on different subjects on which he did not obviously publish. Also, these specific characteristics of these writings pose certain challenges. One of the major challenges is just what I just mentioned. It is sometimes very difficult for most of the even scholars to make sense of these notes. They are very short, they are very laconic, they refer to many things that you have to either know these works thoroughly to be able to make sense of these notes, or have spent a lifetime really working with the Strauss's writings to make sense of them. So in order to remedy this kind of challenge, this kind of problem, early on we decided to include and invite a series of scholars, major scholars of the field who have worked on Leo Strauss or other writings on which Strauss wrote in these notes, to come and write interpretative essays that we have included in this volume. So in this volume that we just published with SUNY, there are about 12 different transcripts, depending on how you count them, obviously, and also 14 interpretative essays dealing with these transcripts and trying to connect them with other writings of Strauss, interpreting them, making sense of them, and making them available. I would like to emphasize the importance of these interpretative essays. I personally find them extremely important, obviously, but also it is not my opinion, but also opinion of the peer reviewers, peer reviewers of our volume, that they said, well, this is one of the major selling points of your volume, that it includes all these interesting interpretative essays by major scholars. And we have significant contributions in the volume. We have one by our good friend and colleague, Professor Ralph Lerner. We have one by Professor Nathan Tarkov, and many others. I cannot go through the whole list. There are so many. All of them extremely important. I'm going to exclude myself from the list because I am also one of the contributors, but the others are extremely important. And I would like to emphasize the importance of these interpretative essays because it was brought to my attention recently that the transcripts included in our volume have been uploaded to some of these illegal sites. The question of copyright doesn't concern me at all. It's the furthest thing from my mind, really. I'm not losing any sleep over it. But it seems that the persons who have uploaded these transcripts, they did not include these interpretative essays. So I thought perhaps it's a common opinion. Some people might think that these interpretative essays are not that important, perhaps. But this cannot be further from the truth, really. They are extremely important. A lot of expertise have gone into these writings. And to tell you the truth, it was the most difficult part of our project. Um, to coordinate all these different scholars, sending in their interpretations and getting feedback and making sure that everything is reflected correctly in the volume. It was a very time-consuming affair, but it was very much worth it because, well, it's really worth the ticket of entry. You can say, not only to have access to these transcripts, but also have access to these interpretative essays. So that was one point that I wanted to emphasize. But I hope that when you get a chance, all of you, to get your hands on this, on a copy of our book, you find it of interest and for your studies, and you find it illuminating for different subjects that appear in the volume. So that was all I had to say on this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rasoul. Maybe one quick, immediate question. Can you sort of say a word or two more about how the genesis of this volume? How did this come about? Why did you?
That's a long story. Actually, well, you know, I had this extraordinary opportunity back in 2016 to end up in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, to work on Leo Strauss archive. And I met Zarko Minkov there. Well, we would share things that we had found in the archive, and we ended up publishing some of them ourselves alone, or some of them together, and I ended publishing the things that were relevant to Islam, for example, on Arabian Nights and on Averroes and Al-Farabi in my own volume on Islamic political thought. But later on, we reached this decision that we have all these transcripts that did not appear anywhere, but they are very valuable. So we thought how we are going to put them together. So we found this common subject, which is not very difficult to find actually, and that is religion, right? Strauss thought and wrote about religion throughout his whole intellectual career. So we decided to put all these transcripts that are somehow related to the question of religion. And then, as I mentioned, we thought that, well, that would not be accessible to many people. We need some kind of contextualization of these transcripts. That's why we decided to invite other people to contribute interpretative essays to this volume. So that is the short version of the story, obviously. But yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful. Zarko, you're up next.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, I'll just say a little bit about the transcript and about Strauss's interest in the symposium, and then we'll get into more substantive matters, especially with Alex's presentation and then our discussion. But I believe that Strauss first taught the symposium in the autumn quarter of 1959 at the University of Chicago, and that's the first transcript that ever got published. It was the course was given in the presence of Peter Heinrich von Blankenhagen, the art historian, and somewhere in the mid-60s, there was interest from Bantam Books to publish course transcripts of Leo Strauss, accompanied by the original texts. And there were, I think, at least 3 courses that were going to be considered for publication and published. There was the Plato's Republic from 1961, and then the Gorgias from 1963, and the Symposium from 1959. And in fact, the Republic was going to be the one to be published first, which is somewhat strange given that City and Man, which has a almost complete interpretation of the Republic, had been just published in 1964. And it was, I actually don't know, or maybe someone in the audience would know, who was commissioned to do the Republic or the Gorgias transcripts, but it was Seth Benedetti who was commissioned with editing and publishing the Symposium transcript, which eventually came out with the University of Chicago Press in 1999. Now, it turned out that actually Bantam was more interested in the original texts, and then Strauss's commentary was going to be a kind of supplement. But I believe it was Basic Books that published the Republic, the translation of the Republic, and that's how I think the project to publish the commentary, the Strauss's transcript on the Republic, fizzled out. That was in 1968. The Symposium, the publication of the Symposium transcript went pretty far by 1966. Some of that information is going to become available in the correspondence between Seth Benedetti and Strauss that it's about to appear with Mercer University Press next year that Hannes mentioned. So Strauss received Benedetti's edition of Strauss's transcript, 1959 transcript on the Symposium, sometime in 1966. But he never got around to looking through it. And eventually, Benedetti lost his edition. He lost the files or whatever he had, the documents. He didn't return to it until the 1990s, and then he did it from scratch. Someone in the audience might add or correct parts of the story. Bantam published Benedetti's translation of Plato's Symposium, maybe in 1986. So that was 2 decades later. In the 90s, Benedetti decided to go back to it, and I saw him work on it in his tiny NYU office in the late 90s. However, Benedetti didn't go to the archive at the time, though he visited Chicago, and he didn't, if I can share this, he didn't have access to Strauss's notebook on the Symposium, which was notebook for the course 1959 course. Let me see. I don't know if is this my screen visible here? That's the notebook. It's 120 pages or so, and that can fill many lacunae and provides many references and shows the underlinings, and there's many other documents and statements that are available in this notebook. So what we have here is, in a way, just a foretaste of a future re-editing of that whole transcript, with the benefit of this complete notebook, which includes a line-by-line commentary. And I mean, it tracks very closely with the transcript, but it supplements it. It's probably 10-15% of the substance is lost in the transcript, and it can be provided by the notebook. I wanted to mention that the original idea for the publication, the recording of the transcripts, maybe not the publication, was that of Robert Horowitz, who was a student of Strauss's and later taught at Kenyon College. So that's kind of the background. Benedetti himself wrote a complete interpretation of the Symposium, and it was going to become a book along with an interpretation of the Protagoras, the gods of the poets. I'm not sure. Maybe someone knows why that didn't come to pass, and only an essay of his has been published. Now, the only thing I want to add here is what is Strauss's account of why he taught the Symposium? And in the Berendet edited transcript, we have two reasons, and I'll read a little bit from the book, and then I'll show something from the notebook. One of them is this: there are many competitors with philosophy, or many alternatives to philosophy. But the most important of them, according to Plato, is poetry, not science. From Plato's point of view, what we call science is simply and obviously subordinate to philosophy, and therefore not a competitor. Nor can one say religion, because religion is not a Greek term. One would have to say piety. But piety is, from Plato's point of view, no competitor with philosophy, because philosophy, rightly understood, is the true piety. The competitor is poetry, especially tragedy, which has the broadest and deepest appeal because it moves most men most deeply. And he elaborates this reason and goes on for a few minutes or a few pages. The second reason, this is as published in the transcript, the second reason why the Symposium is important is this: the theme common to poetry and philosophy is the human things. The human things, however, are primarily the political things. For mankind's great objectives, most impressive objectives, are political: freedom and empire. One might also say peace and war are clearly political phenomena. It says, don't forget the title of what is somehow the greatest modern novel, War and Peace. Even today, Khrushchev and Eisenhower feed the headlines to a much higher degree than the White Sox or Ingrid Bergman. If one wants to see, if baseball fans want to see Strauss's handwriting, or the White Sox in Strauss's handwriting, I can probably show you that. Well, no, this is the wrong. Yeah. Okay. So this is the second reason. Now, what's interesting is that I'm not if I can find the White Sox very quickly here. What's interesting, so you see reason number 2 in the notebook, and it's rather extensive. And then he gives a third reason, which of course is related, but it's lost in the transcript, because he didn't deliver it. You see here, there's a line where it says number 3, Symposium. I don't know if that's really, yeah, but I guess number 3 is easy to read in his handwriting, even in his handwriting. So it says Eros discussion, especially with poets, connection between Eros and poetry. When he summarizes the reason for studying the Symposium in the transcript, as published by Benedetti, Strauss says, the Symposium is the dialogue of the conflict between philosophy and poetry, where the poets are in a position to defend themselves. Now, right before that, he had inserted this point number 3. So it is present, but it's not identified as the third reason. He says, one more thing. It is somehow the contention of Plato that the nature of man, and in a way the nature of the whole, is eros. So this is represented by this third point or third reason. This is what I read from is page 10 the 1999 University of Chicago transcript on Plato's Symposium. So while I'm on the screen, I want to show a little bit of the nature of this document. You see here Strauss and Blankenhagen were passing notes during the course in a very naughty way. So this is Blankenhagen note about Alcibiades. Strauss kept it in his notebook. P.H. von Bruell scripsit, right? That's what he identifies now. This is many years later, an unpublished manuscript of Blankenhagen's on the seating arrangement, the couches and everything else in Agathon's house was published posthumously, which I think would be a very good supplement to Strauss's transcript. Now, one more point before we go to Alex. The commentary I myself provided for this volume had to do with Agathon, and it's a kind of a vindication of the seriousness of Agathon, and which you can see in the notebook, as well as in the transcript, but a little more in the notebook, the philosophical character of Agathon's speech. But there's at least two problems or questions there. I'm going to state them. The first reason for teaching the Symposium that Strauss gave, which I read, is that the biggest competitor to philosophy is tragedy. But Agathon is presented by Strauss as a kind of ally to Socrates and as someone who almost gets it, or almost raises the philosophical question and almost gets it. So it doesn't sound like a fundamental competitor. It sounds like someone who has understood the human soul or its mysteries 85% or something like that. Whereas Aristophanes, who is more gifted, goes more giftedly and more powerfully in the wrong direction. Instead, that's a kind of difficulty. I mean, it's and the, from the point of view of the other one is that maybe this is more accidental, is that, I mean, Aristophanes is superior as a person, Strauss says, than Agathon. But tragedy in the hands of the self-conscious tragedian who knows what he's doing, is the superior genre. So that's a kind of difficult. And I think we have a chance to discuss it and see more about what Strauss's intention with the Symposium was. I think, Alex?
Thank you, Zarko. And thanks to Leo Strauss Foundation for sponsoring this. I assume that involves Rasoul, Zarko, and Hannes's handsome honoraria, because I'm not getting paid. My essay in this volume is called Leo Strauss's Intention with Plato's Symposium. And it tries to offer a kind of gloss on what may be the significance of his interpretation of the Symposium for his work as a whole, what he may have intended in teaching, but also in maybe sketching what seems to be the sketch for an essay, and then why he may have abandoned it, not just for practical reasons, but philosophic reasons. I'll try to offer a kind of brief overview of some of the things I found most rewarding that are in my essay, as well as maybe indicate things that I think are interesting to discuss, but I won't have time to go into right now. I would like to first draw attention to the circumstances surrounding the course. The course was, according to Seth Benedetti, held partly in honor of Strauss's friend, Peter Heinrich von Blankenhagen. And there's also this interesting fact that it seemed to have generated some interest among students, in particular Benedetti and Hillel Gilden, and that this seems to have been behind some of the interest in publishing it. At the very least, this seems to explain why this course was published nearly 2 decades before any others in 2001. And I'll say at the time I was an undergraduate, early in undergraduate, and I got interested in Strauss pretty early. And I was pointed to this, and it helped kindle my interest in Plato. And, with all the mystique surrounding Strauss, his students, the transcripts, they were very heavily guarded then. Now that they're available to anybody of the meanest capacities, as Strauss likes to say. But it was a kind of glimpse and a kind of hope to get into this sort of more sort of open expression of his thought. Though I think after it doesn't take long to realize that you never really get that close. It's not clear how any public presentation of his thought, whether final or preliminary, how adequate it is to his thought. Now, the Symposium course was in 1959, and in the context of Strauss's path of thinking, I think it's significant to know that he's teaching this in the recent wake of his sort of landmark study of Machiavelli. He returned to Machiavelli, or he published this work on Machiavelli, which already in 1935, in his book on Hobbes, he realized maybe he would have to engage in. And certainly when he published the later preface, so the Hobbes book is from 1935, the English translation, and then when he published the preface to the English edition in 1952, he felt comfortable giving the title of the founder of modernity to Machiavelli as opposed to Hobbes. And so it was only in the wake of that Strauss started to engage, and he himself points to this in the preface to the Seventh Impression of Natural Right and History. It's only then he started to engage in a series of interpretations of Socratic works, published interpretations of Socratic works. He has some writings on non-Socratic ancient texts. Obviously, on tyranny is probably the most important example. And also, he commented on the Republic and the Protagoras in some of these longer review essays. Those interpretations are very cursory, preliminary, and sort of partial. And he does have what I would characterize as a highly rhetorical and very exoteric accounts of classic natural right, which is not the same thing necessarily as an account of Socrates. And so it was really only after 1959 that after the study on Machiavelli, that you start to get this series of interpretations with The City of Man in 1964. So this led me to ask the following question. Did Strauss intend or toy around at least with the idea of writing something on Plato's Symposium as his first publication on a Socratic work of classical political philosophy? I'll just note that the sketch we have contains a lot of similar reflections on how to read Plato. This could, of course, just be a function of a lecture he gave or some kind of talk he presented. But at the very least, it showed that he was willing to situate the Symposium in conjunction with the same sort of interpretive guidelines. And his remarks on the closeness of the Symposium to the Republic suggest that in any case, we might want to think about why he might have felt comfortable giving it the same pride of place and the relation between these two dialogues for his thinking. So the question of abandonment is at least useful as a heuristic for understanding Strauss's, abandoning this project is useful for thinking about the relation between these two dialogues. But it's also worth noting that the way Strauss introduces the Symposium brings it very close to the question with which the Cydian man ends, quidsit Deus. He draws attention in the both the course transcript and in the sketch that's found in Leo Strauss on religion to the uniqueness of the symposium on three fronts: the title, the form, and the theme. The title points to an occasion, the Sicilian expedition, and ultimately Strauss argues to the hubris or arrogance of Socrates. The form, which is a double narration, is related to this hubris in that there's a kind of gossipy air about this event. And then the theme shows why there was gossip and what the hubris consisted in that Socrates denies the divinity of a god, specifically Eros. And you could say that the theme of the symposium, the question, what is Eros, Eros the god, is in a way a kind of safer substitute for the question quidsit Deus. There's also other reasons to take seriously the interpretation of the symposium as an alternative, insofar as Socrates and Aristophanes, which gets into the question of theology, picking up where the Cydian man effectively left off, in the chapter on the birds, points to the disagreement between Aristophanes and Socrates, not just in the work of Aristophanes, but in the Symposium. And in that chapter, Strauss says the following. He says that Aristophanes is not opposed to philosophy simply, but only to a philosophy that, disregarding Eros, has no link with poetry. Socrates, no link, you could say that the Symposium responds to this point by saying, well, there is a link, some link, what that link is, and therefore what the link is between philosophy and poetry and how this works out with Eros, is very important to settling the question that's embedded in the very title of this book, Socrates and Aristophanes. And Strauss says at the end of this paragraph in Socrates and Aristophanes, Socrates' doctrine is shown therein to be more profoundly erotic than Aristophanes or any other poets. What he means by profoundly erotic is difficult to say, and I think his interpretation of the Symposium helps us make some headway in thinking about that question. And the key, I think, there is in looking at both the course lecture transcript and the sketch, is to think about what Strauss means by the poetic presentation of philosophy. Okay. Strauss says the following in the course. He says, Socrates, far from being an unerotic man, is the erotician. It is not true that poetry is the capstone of philosophy. On the contrary, philosophy is the capstone of poetry. More specifically, he says the right kind of philosophy is more truly poetic than poetry in the common sense of the term. When discussing this, he points both to Socrates, but I think ultimately to Plato. And so thinking about the poetic presentation of philosophy, one has to think not just of Socrates' speech in the Symposium, which he goes on to outline, and I'll try to say something about that, but also to Plato. I'll try to say something about that too. Now, for the purposes of outlining this question, I skip over both in the essay, and I'll do that now, the first three speeches in the Symposium, those of Phaedrus, Pausanias, and Eryximachus. Instead, I'll look to the speeches of the poets Aristophanes and Agathon and the philosopher Socrates. And Strauss sets these three apart as the only speeches that analyze Eros by the ends intrinsic to it. And he identifies these ends as ugliness, beauty, and the good, respectively to Aristophanes, Agathon, and Socrates. Now, I think it's strange, both when looking at Strauss's interpretations and when thinking about the Symposium on your own, that see Aristophanes as positing ugliness as the end of Eros. I think our first inclination to say is a love of one's own. But if I could offer a gloss on Strauss's interpretation, and this is going to be interpretive itself because he never really puts all the pieces together in a way that sort of concentrates all the observations. But it seems like what Strauss is suggesting is that Aristophanes conceives of eros as love of one's own, most fundamentally in the sense of an individual's longing for their transcendence, the transcendence of his fragmentary and artificial condition toward a higher natural and prior unity, over and against the restraints imposed by just and vengeful gods. These gods warn that such eros is tragic and ugly. There's something monstrous, you could say, about our original unity in its overreaching pride, and instead demand, on pains of further punishment, that it be restrained to one's own in a conventional sense, namely to one's own fatherland and its laws, or to the gods who supply, and to the gods who supply or support these laws. So you could say that eros there as love of the ugly, or as one of one's own, restricted to one's own in this political sense, here is very much focused on justice. The difficulty comes in, and this is, I'll just echo Rasoul's comments on the importance of the interpretive essays. The difficulty with the sketch that's found in Leo Strauss on religion as regards Agathon is that he has only one line on it. He just says Agathon, eros of the beautiful, and then in parentheses, does not equal one's own. And this, so I commend Zarko's essay to you all, since he can help flesh out why that would be an important observation. But if you want to go from the heights of Zarko Minkov to the lows of Leo Strauss, you can also go to his chapter, his remarks in the lecture, the course transcript, which is what I do in my essay. And what you get from Agathon's essay, Agathon's speech, is this view that, and I'm quoting Strauss here, eros is as a self-subsisting being is nothing, since he has come to being out of nothing. He is only by virtue of the poet. So it's the poet who makes the gods beautiful, right? The poets are, again, to quote Strauss, the makers of the gods of human shape. They deify what in itself is not divine. And Strauss's remark on Alcibiades as the kind of raw material out of which one might make a god, he kind of looks like Dionysus, but I think are really remarkable on this. But continuing, he says, they create the gods. Why? Because they are inspired by the love of beauty. So the gods, if they are only by virtue of the poet, as Agathon asserts or implies, then what is their source material? Well, it is the human being. Therefore, they're a beautification of the human being. Eros, therefore, is a love of the beautiful, and in this creation of a beautiful as something beneath it. Now, the importance of these two poets, their two speeches, is that if we put them together, we get a union of beautiful gods and avenging gods, which are generated out of the twin objects of eros, one's own and the beautiful. They have a common root in them. And so what you get, I think, if you situate this interpretation of the Symposium within the context of Strauss's oeuvre as a whole, is the following sort of thought. In the wake of his study of Machiavelli on the theological political problem, and thereby the completion of his sort of major studies of modernity, Strauss takes up this task of presenting his understanding of Socrates publicly. And the first of these is the City and Man, which ends with the question, Quid sit Deus, which his next book, Socrates and Aristophanes, takes up more directly. And then again, in that chapter on the birds, he points to the Symposium, and specifically the disagreement between Aristophanes and Socrates on the question of eros. And what you get out of that is that the poets treat separately, the poets in the Symposium, separately treat the twin passions out of which the gods of the city are generated, love of one's own, love of the beautiful, which Socrates then situates relative to a third form of eros, as it were, the love of the good. Let me see, how am I doing on time? Do I have a few minutes left? Okay. Now, Socrates' speech, one of the most, I think, eye-opening things about Socrates' speech, or Strauss's interpretation of Socrates' speech, both in the lecture course, but especially in the sketch, and this is one of the great things, is he's often referring to something like this sketch or outline in the lecture course. Now you have it with a kind of bare bones sort of setting it out. But the way he divides the whole symposium, but specifically Socrates' speech, into 7 parts. The fourth part of which involves an abstraction from, and then from the beautiful, or love of the beautiful, and then a reassertion of the love of the beautiful in the ladder of love. This involves what Strauss refers to as first a philosophic presentation of poetry in that abstraction, and then when it's reasserted, a poetic presentation of philosophy. This involves an assimilation as a result of this, a subordination of love of the beautiful to love of the good. And in Strauss's remarks on this, he's very cagey about describing the love of the good as a form of eros. In fact, he often hesitates and calls it a desire for the good. And if this comes up in the question and answer, I can point to some of his comments in the lecture course. But it's something you really need to reread the whole thing and then follow it out and trace it carefully, because it is a kind of a grave difficulty. And I'm not sure how much he comes down on it, but he seems to be he certainly separates from the desire for the good, the desire for reproduction. But the salient point to the question of the gods here is that the restoration of the beautiful in the ladder of love does not involve a restoration of gods and immortality proper, right? And it turns out that in that fourth section, where he denies love of one's own as an object of eros, or he highly subordinates it. And it seems like at that point, the gods are out of the picture. And so you don't get a theological presentation in the end of Socrates' speech. What takes the place of the gods and everlasting fame, and even immortality proper, is the subsequent, this poetic presentation of philosophy within chance, which enchants by presenting philosophy as though it is the highest assimilation of eros to the desire for sempiternal possession of the good. I think maybe I'll just say one last thing on Plato, and then I'll end it there, how he fits into this poetic presentation of philosophy. And Strauss remarks in a number of places, I think in the sketch, as well as in his letters to Benedetti and in the course, how this helps shed light on Alfarabi's remark in the Plato on how Plato combined the way of Socrates and the way of Thrasymachus. Strauss observes that Socrates is not a poet, but a rhetor. And he's thinking about the Gorgias here. He says he could not write punitive speeches. And his evidence for this is his dialogue with Polus versus his dialogue with Callicles. Strauss says the following: Socrates can persuade Polus because he can persuade him by dialectic, by proofs. He cannot persuade Callicles truly because Callicles could not be persuaded truly without recourse to threats, without recourse to punitive speeches, to speeches which in the last resort appeal to avenging gods. It was Plato, rather, who could put together the way of Socrates, way of dialectic with the way of Thrasymachus, these punitive speeches. The question this, of course, raises is what takes the place of the gods in Plato's work. One can think of the myths, but really thinking about other aspects of Plato's teaching, I think this is an important question that's generated out of this symposium. Okay, I'll stop there. I could make some more remarks on his abandonment of the symposium and some of the circumstances surrounding. My essay ends with an admittedly wild speculation about why it took so long, but I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to all three of you. To kickstart the panel discussion, and I also encourage those in the audience to either sort of soon raise your hand if there is a point you want to make, or also write your question in the Q&A feature. And I will in due course call on members of the audience. But before we do that, let's discuss these three contributions amongst in this elect group of the four of us. I have a question that sort of starts from Alex's contribution and is maybe directed to Alex, but I would love it if Rasoul and Zarko also jumped in. Well, it's really two questions. Two separate questions. The first one is, Alex, I think you highlighted very nicely that this symposium, this engagement with the symposium is kind of in the wake of Thoughts on Machiavelli, and that after Thoughts on Machiavelli, which came out in 58, Strauss really turned to this intense study of Socrates and ancient political philosophy. So City and Man comes out in 64, Socrates and Aristophanes in 66. Then the two books on Xenophon in the early 70s, and then, of course, Argument and the Action, published posthumously. Um, how do you think about this not as a historical biographical question, but as sort of something that shows the structure of what he deemed to be important or the path that he was on? Did Thoughts on Machiavelli pose a kind of question that he needed to investigate in the ancients because he couldn't sort of fully answer it in Machiavelli? Or did he maybe did it maybe free himself? Did he sort of answer a question in Thoughts on Machiavelli, which sort of left him the freedom to explore other questions, while sort of certain questions, of course, return? I mean, a more simple-minded way of asking a very similar question, I think, at the end of the day, is sort of, you said, and Strauss says that what is eros is a version of the question, quid sit Deus? But I also wonder, like, if it's a version, sort of what's the shortcoming? Sort of what's the difference of engaging the God of the revealed religions and the gods of the polis? So I'd like you to maybe say a few words about your ideas. I know that both are sort of questions that could easily fill another morning discussion, but I'd like you to unfold your thoughts, and Rasoul and Zarko, please jump in.
I'll keep this simple because it's just too difficult, those questions. But I'll
You're
say,
not allowed to do that.
yeah, I mean, one thing, and this will maybe bring liberalism, ancient and modern, which I think is sometimes unfairly set to the side, but it's remarkable how many of these Socratic works involve great attention to critics of Socrates, even friendly critics like Xenophon. And you see this also in studies in Platonic political philosophy. And then even at the end of his life, Strauss's final three courses are the Gorgias, Thucydides, and Nietzsche. And so again, friendly critics, or kind of realist, you could say, critics of maybe an unfairly characterized as a idealist Socrates. But in so on that point, so in Liberalism and Ancient and Modern, you have that sort of magnificent essay on Lucretius, right? Which also concerns the question of theology, picking up from Socrates and Aristophanes. And so that would be one thing to say, that it's not clear that, and I think I overstated this in the essay, but it's not clear that he just completed his study, but there's a way in which the Socratic works are furthering of the study of this critique of the ancients, but a kind of internal critique from among the ancients. So that's one thought. As regards the question of revealed religion here, I owe some. Maybe Zarko can jump in here. But the ways in which this is sort of the penultimate paragraph in my essays on this question about what are the difficulties with Strauss's interpretation, as I, understand it, and which is, to the best of my abilities, is what seems to be a kind of conflict or contradiction even in his interpretation of Aristophanes, where Aristophanes is taken to be the representative of the making of the vengeful gods. And yet ultimately, Strauss points out that there's a kind of criticism of Aristophanes that he's not really able to enchant. He's not the highest kind of poet. And this is something Zarko referred to. So it seems like there's a way in which Aristophanes is made to represent something he can't really represent, which means you might have to turn elsewhere. And maybe that's why Strauss turned elsewhere. There's also this remark, and this I have a remark on this in my essay, but it's really picking up on something Zarko pointed out to me, which is that in Aristophanes' speech, the cosmic gods and the Olympian gods exist side by side, and we're changed in form from one to the other. Whereas in the biblical account, all of this is subordinated to God. So the basic premises of the view and how that works out on the highest level, I haven't thought through. But you can see that at least on the purely formal level, there's a real fundamental difference between these, and whether that amounts to a difference enough that the argument can be applied from one to the other is not something I've worked out, but it's worth obviously taking pause over.
Rasoul, I can say something quick, a little bit biographical about Strauss, and then Rasoul. Yeah, I mean, he obviously didn't abandon Aristophanes, so his really serious study of Aristophanes began after this course. So it's not. So I mean, the problem is there that you say, but he turned to Aristophanes even more intensely after. There is one line, I think it's in one of these letters to Benedetti, where he says, I changed my mind about tragedy. That's in 59. Now, he had, and another point he says, I have my daimon, Socrates has a daimon. My daimon always prevented me from studying the tragedies. I was studying some other things, but I didn't study it. But he has some view. But in 59, he says, I changed my mind as a result of studying the Symposium regarding Plato's view of tragedy. Tragedy is not some conflict of the kala, of reconcilable goods or beautiful things, but it's reconciliation through the conscious construction of the gods. But then, so the tragedy is higher. But I think in Socrates and Aristophanes later, it's reversed. Comedy is higher as such. Because comedy builds on tragedy several times. It's in notes, but it's in the book itself that comedy builds on tragedy. So it presupposes, I don't know what you can say, it's more tragedy is more fundamental, but the other one is higher, I don't know. But comedy builds on tragedy. And if someone says, oh, what about death? What about suffering? What about love proper? It says, comedian thought it through, and those are not the highest things. That's very, harsh or anyway strange thing, but that's the kind of the. So I think there's another reversal. There's a lot of things happening, and I'm not even bringing in Machiavelli as you do and as one should. That there's this change. In 59, it looks like tragedy is higher, if it means, but that's conflict. I mean, as I point out, that's conflicting with this point that the whole course is about the conflict between tragedy and philosophy. Philosophy being the only non-tragic way to live, as he says elsewhere, right? But I think I just want to add very quickly is the Kruger, because Kruger is a Christian. Oh yeah, I want to. Maybe you can dispose of something very quickly. I don't think he ever says directly that Aristophanes, or indirect, Aristophanes stands for Jerusalem. I don't think he actually says that.
No, he doesn't. But I think there's a temptation there because of the just avenging gods.
Yes. Okay. That's fine. Yeah, so he doesn't explicitly say it, but there's a temptation. He's a rebel.
And also just the characterization, and this is moving away from Aristophanes to Agathon, this characterization of this as a psychology that generates the gods of the city complicates that as well, right? You have the just avenging gods, but then you have the gods of the city. These are not, I guess, taken the same, or how we're supposed to take that? in relation to Jerusalem is complicated. But as far as like just a sort of analysis of politics, you do wonder, you are tempted to go in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we have the time. If we have time to fill this in, I can then bring in the Kruger thing, which is that Kruger is very explicit, and Strauss talks about it, about eros serving the function of Christ, that it's in between man and God, and then what Strauss has to say. And I can read the Kruger passages about that.
Maybe Rasoul, you want to jump into the many important issues that we've raised: tragedy, comedy, agathon, Jerusalem, quid Deus, what is Eros, Machiavelli, and Socrates?
Well, I think the main points were raised already. I mean, preference for comedy, I think, is quite emphatic in Strauss. And you can see it everywhere. I mean, recently I have been teaching Arabian Nights, and I'm reminded constantly of the notes that Strauss took on Arabian Nights. And he mentioned somewhere that Arabian Nights contains all these kinds of stories that seem like tragedies, that somebody is really reminds you really of Sophocles, right? People are really trying to run away from their fate, but constantly they encounter some difficulties. They end up killing somebody who they didn't want to kill, and but at the end of the day, Arabian Nights for Strauss is a comedy, and that's why he reads it as a kind of philosophical work. And I think everybody knows about these kind of comments that he used to make, that if you read a philosophical work and you don't laugh, it is not a philosophical work, or you haven't understood it. Which I think, well, it depends on the work, I suppose, but it tells you something about the kind of philosophical training that he had in mind, that you have to learn to see comedy in different kinds of philosophical works. Even if they sound very serious, you have to find comedy somewhere there. So yeah, that's the only comment that I had. Yeah.
Alex, maybe you want to, since you've been viciously attacked by Zarko, do you want to respond?
No, I mean, I can see why he'd attack me. He can't be made young and beautiful, as he noted. So he's sad he can't be divinized. So I think Rana wants to ask a question.
Yes. Rana, you can talk now. If you want, you can also share your video. You definitely have to unmute yourself.
Okay, unmuted. Let's see.
Unmask and unmute.
How do I share my video? I don't see.
Maybe, well, we can hear you very well, and we.
Okay, that's fine.
The usual thing I don't see with the video.
Maybe it's a feature of the webinar. Maybe you're prohibited. We're commanding you
Oh,
to.
maybe I can't. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this was amazing. Thank you all. And I have way too many thoughts, so I'm going to try to talk quickly. First of all, the last thing you were just talking about, it does seem we all assume Strauss believes comedy is higher. And I think you want to put a lot of emphasis on that one line at the end of the symposium, that the tragic poet who writes by art could also, write comedy, and not the other way around, which I remember always surprised me. So it's so interesting, all the comments Strauss makes about that, about it has to be tragedy on the outside, but comedy in the inside. And that's the only thing that would make tragedy higher than comedy, if it is already self-contains comedy within it. I'm not sure what he has in mind. I'll ask you guys to think about that and tell me what you think. So that's one point. Another thing, you asked the question about Benedetti. He got about the idea of a book on the Protagoras. He had such a great quadruple, Gorgias and Phaedrus connected to Protagoras and Symposium as the theological counterparts. And he was going to write that book, and why he didn't do it. I think wow, some motorcycle rider outside doesn't like me. I think that he ran out of time in a way. he had sort of already done the work on the Protagoras, the essay, and the Symposium mostly. And I have some letters I'm finding now from 1990s or early 90s. He was getting so excited about the Philebus, translating it and, and commenting on it and teaching it. So that was the next book, the Philebus. And then he had the Odyssey looming. And I guess those were the last two books, really. It just dawned on me. So they were, he didn't write the Protagoras Symposium because he had done those essays and he really wanted to get to those other books. Can I add one other thing I want to say? Oh, this is just a formula, but it really dawned on me. The poetic presentation of philosophy makes me want to think some more about the poetic presentation of tyranny as eros in Republic 9. I think that is worth further thought. And one last thing. I think one of the great things about these notes and what you guys have been saying about it is, for me, how much it opens up Agathon's speech. I mean,
Yes.
I love Alcibiades. Everybody loves Aristophanes' speech. But the Agathon speech and this idea that the self-subsistent being is nothing and nothing comes from nothing and so on, why Agathon is the representative of tragedy as the rival to philosophy. And here's just one last point about it. He has that comment about turning the verb into a noun, which brought so many things together for me. So the reality is to love, right, Aaron? And the poets personify that into a being, Eros with a capital E, and that's the God. And that is, I think some of us saw, that happens absolutely explicitly in Hesiod's Theogony, the verb, but it goes the other way. You debunk the God by turning it into the verb. It's also a clue to Maimonides, the verbs and the nouns. I mean, so many things came together in that point. I'll just leave it at that. I'm talking too much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rana. I think now we should sort of make the rounds and comment on this, since this was Alex, why don't you start, or Rasoul, or Zarko? I'll make an executive decision. Zarko, you start. And
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly true. That's undeniable that Agathon is somehow vindicated. I'm not sure what to make of it at the end of the day, especially given the later correction or clarification that Aristophanes in comedy is superior. I mean, the simple thing, I don't know how far this goes, is that Socrates could not draw on a reservoir of indignant sentiment, and therefore couldn't. So therefore, he needed an ally. This has to do with Alex's comments too, and it has to be a tragic poet. And so then it's a subordinate tragedian that Socrates needs as to control these speeches of avenging gods. I mean, of course, there's this difficulty. Agathon is not talking about avenging gods, beautifying gods. I guess that's somehow the general direction of the New Testament, that because it is a Christian lens view, that the Old Testament is an angry God and there's a more loving God, different kind of rhetoric, and that Plato and Socrates somehow moved in that direction. Yeah, so I mean it's always strange to think of that Socrates had that one limitation. I think there's another limitation somewhere in the Lucretius essay, that if it's something is absolutely bleak, philosophy can't sugarcoat it or something like that, is unable to do it because it would require lying too much to yourself. But yeah, that's Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I want to maybe see if Rana has a suggestion or someone else has a suggestion. Because I mean, I'm the one who said that Agathon is so great according to Strauss and is philosophic, but it stops. Yeah, but it sees as a kind of ally, not something more. Yes, yeah, Alex.
I think it might be helpful to think about not just why he's great, but also how his sort of this rehabilitation of Agathon is not without its limits, right? So one thing that Strauss makes clear is that no poet can actually give a philosophic presentation of poetry because it would involve a disenchantment with the poet's own activity. The only poetic presentation of philosophy you get is in the clouds in a comedy. And so it makes it ridiculous and disenchants the audience with it. So I think what Socrates is on the lookout for is not really an ally so much as a poet who is himself a philosopher as well. And this, I think, might point in the direction of how comedy in some philosophic form could be higher than tragedy, but it's not the comedic poet, right? The poet who's writing a comedy, but it's got so and Strauss does in a few moments point to certain ways in which Socrates' speech addresses Agathon, and one might draw conclusions from the speech, but it would be rash to attribute those to Socrates. I have a footnote on this, and there's at least three places I noticed this in the course transcript. And that might also show the limits of Agathon as a poet and therefore as sub-philosophic and the need for somebody more like Plato, it's hard. You don't want to call him a poet simply, right? Because you don't want to confuse him with somebody like Agathon, though there's obviously poetic elements.
Rasoul, do you want to jump in here? Maybe Zarko, can you mentioned at the beginning of your contribution that sort of Agathon is this competitor of Socrates and potential ally, but who doesn't quite get it. Do you want to sort of drill down a little bit deeper into his deficiencies, but also potentially the attractiveness of his position for Socrates?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a general statement. I mean, so when especially since at the beginning of Socrates' speech, he says he's going to present it in the light of his one-on-one with Agathon. As you can look at what the Greek is, but you know,
Yeah.
right? It's a we can just think of that. I'm not. I mean, we can. There's someone in the audience called David Levy who might have something who has asked the question, who might have something to say about it. Because on the surface, it looks like so Agathon doesn't want to have this argument with Socrates. He capitulates very easily because Socrates says, "Oh, you showed that you're very needy in love. You don't have it." He gives him, I think he gives him a little bit of an out by saying, "Oh, you might be still beautiful and in possession of the beautiful things, but want to keep them. So you're not desperately needy." But I think that still implies that you can lose, let's say, the good things and the beautiful things. That's a thing something you have to clarify. But and therefore you're somehow desperate or worried. So eros is a kind of lack or neediness or clinginess, and is therefore kind of ugly. That's what young Socrates used to think, and that's it. Just so happens Diotima was able to disabuse him of that. But and Agathon doesn't. He just takes it lying down. He doesn't object to it. So, what would be that? What's the significance of that one-on-one? Right, so that would mean love is ugly. So it's like a bit of like a Machiavellian thing that you, as one of our friends says, Harvey Mansfield, in reading Machiavelli, "I love you" means I want something from you, or I need. So it's something greedy or ugly in that sense. Though I mean, you can vindicate greed in another way if it's greed for the truly good. So yeah, so this would be, I mean, this would be, and I think this is one of the contributions of this of this volume. It does reconstitute. That's missing from the transcript. It reconstitutes that the one-on-one. But
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Maybe someone. I mean, I'm calling on David Levy if I can to
We can do that in a second. I'll just read. David made a very interesting observation. Wrote a very interesting observation in the Q&A. I'll just read that real quick. It's on the issue of Socrates versus the poets. He says in the Symposium course, for those who have the book in their hands, on page 241, Strauss argues that in Diotima's speech, at the higher levels of the ladder of love, the beauty of the sciences, the beautiful itself, Diotima's language indicates that there is, strictly speaking, no eros of the beautiful. There's only beholding the beautiful. Strauss explains that this is because, quote, eros can never be divorced from body, unquote, and, quote, there's no eros except for living human beings, unquote. And then David asks you to comment. I wonder what the panelists make of this statement and whether for Strauss, this is one reason why the poets think that Socrates, who seeks apparently the beautiful itself, is fundamentally unerotic, and whether Strauss thinks that the poets may have a point here. Alex, I think you should start because Zarko was just blabbering on, and then Rasoul, you should jump in, and Zarko, you get the final spot.
I'll say I think this is an incredibly important point,
Yes.
though, and this is part of the reason I think Strauss is so cagey about calling the love of the good, or at least of the good things, a form of eros, for precisely this reason. Though I think it's important not to let that consideration push one too hard against a poetic aspect of philosophy's public presentation, which it seems is clearly what Socrates is after, right? And specifically this question about eros for living human beings. I think it's also important to understand in the Republic how that eros is co-opted through moral education, where your eros is not for the other as a sort of a higher sort of object, but as a object that one can eventually become, right, or come to emulate the creations of the poets. And it's clear that the Platonic Socrates serves in this manner. He becomes a kind of creature that people try to emulate, and obviously Aristodemus is the classic example of this, right? He's shoeless and like Socrates, and he says brash things apparently like Socrates, but he can't drink as much, and he's small and all this stuff. He can't perfectly imitate him. So, and I think what Strauss is trying to articulate is how, despite this fact, there's a way in which the city co-opts eros and that the poet co-opts eros from its proper object of a living human being through something like a moral education, and how Socrates seems to be on the search for somebody who can do that. And he even provides a kind of a beginner's guide in his speech, which doesn't go that far. And I think it's interesting in this regard that in many places you see these lovers of Socrates who want to become like him. Agathon is attracted to his wisdom, and so this. I think one wants to be careful about being tying eros too much to living human beings, because it's clear that while that might be the proper object, it can be co-opted and become quasi or pseudo philosophic, and that this is part of Plato and Socrates' project.
Rasoul and Zarko, you now get a chance.
I mean, I feel like it would be better to talk to a living human being. If David wants to because I'm not sure what the bear. I mean, there's too many complicated options that so therefore Socrates is erotic fundamentally, and the thing you find at the end, the disappearance of eros, is a critique of Diotima's theory rather than a critique of eros. Is that?
I'll just allow David to talk. David, I don't know if you want to jump in, but if you want to jump in, you can.
And
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Hannes. Yeah, I'll say first of all, I don't believe that I understand. I'm quite confident I don't understand what Strauss is ultimately getting at here. But just to cite another passage a few pages later, on page 248, he says, "This poetic presentation of philosophy leads us to see that eros is, strictly speaking, only eros for human beings. Eros, then, is not the best helper for human nature. In other words, the dialogue ends with a depreciation of eros."
Hmm. I see. Right. That's 248 of the transcript, which is
248,
yeah.
right, in the middle of that page.
Yeah.
And I'm just very struck by this interpretation of Strauss, which, I mean, if that again leads me to think that for Strauss, there's a sense in which Socrates is not the most deeply erotic kind of a person, but that might not be a criticism of Socrates if, in fact, Eros is not the best helper for human nature. I mean, I'm not sure whether we're supposed to think that the way that this reads as a kind of it reads as though Strauss is sees Socrates as depreciating Eros and agrees with Socrates. This particular passage reads to me that way, but I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. But
We
what's
should
the
be
other? What's the
clear.
other daimon that's better? That's more helpful. If that's, I mean, if it's a kind of restatement of Diotimus, that you cannot easily find a better helper, because there's no example given in
We
the.
should be clear. That's a line from the Symposium, right?
Can I just add one thing that right? It's a line from the Symposium from Socrates' last from Socrates from the end of
Yeah.
the Diotimus section. At the in the paragraph I just read, at the end of that paragraph, Strauss seems to say that what replaces eros, which is of the beautiful, or eros for the beautiful, is love of the good. He says it. He says he's talking about the Phaedrus. I'll skip that part, but he says even here, in other words, in the Phaedrus, we are not permitted to forget the crucial importance of the love of gain, which is a humble representative of the love for true gain, true wealth, the wealth of the soul, wisdom. And he apparently distinguishes the love of gain from eros here.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's good. You have to see more about that.
Which leads me to think that philosophy is not really erotic. There's a sense in which the poets are right that Socrates and philosophy are not really erotic.
Okay.
Okay.
Alex, Zarko, Rasoul, do you want to defend philosophy, or should we leave it at this harsh attack by David Levy on?
No. David Levy being one of Chris Bruell's best students and friends. Well, no, it's not.
I think we should be clear. I think David believes, and perhaps
Yes.
believes probably, that he is defending philosophy.
I was partly jesting.
I think I find it difficult. You have to track all these steps, because eros initially seems like it's for both the beautiful and the good, and then if it then it gets maybe restricted only to the beautiful, and then that's how it works. Yeah. That there's a question by Professor Stuart Warner about Benedetti and Strauss, and I heard Benedetti discuss this question of eros, and he had a big disagreement with a classics professor, Helmut Flasshar, about this, whether eros is of the good or of the beautiful. And the classics professor said, "Oh, same thing. Eros tu kalu is the same as eros tu agatu." And Benedetti said, "No, they're radically different."
It is my obligation as the moderator to correct a confusion that is easily made. You're thinking of the wrong David Levy.
Oh, that's the Yeah.
But I'll use this as a transition to have a proper Bruell student ask a question, namely Tom Cleveland, who can ask his question now. Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
And I want to say something. Thank you for your comments at the top, and especially your mention of the question of the question of nature and the thought of Leo Strauss, because I think in part our friendship is based on arguing about that particular essay. So, and my question is sort of just a comment, and I was thinking back in a previous one of these sessions where Eric Bazzetti had outlined different approaches to Strauss on the theological problem, one being the dialectical investigation of justice, the other being natural theology associated with the question, quid sit Deus? And he made the interesting suggestion that a good way to work out, how to think about this in Strauss's thought, or maybe in Socratic thought, is the Oikonomicus and Strauss's commentary on the Oikonomicus, because you can pretty clearly see both approaches being present there. And just in this conversation, I haven't had a chance actually to look at the notes that form the basis of this discussion, but it occurred to me that the symposium likewise would plausibly be a good locus for that kind of thinking, insofar as the question, what is eros, I think, as Alex and others said, is a version of, what is a god, or at least this god. And there's some kind of, so to speak, natural theological thinking, especially at the beginning of the Diatima section. But at the same time, the ladder of love culminates in the necessity of investigating noble laws and practices, which I'm glossing here as dialectical investigation of justice. The endpoint being, in my mind, to second this David Levy, and probably, I think, the other one, that the beautiful ceases to be an object of longing and eros is destroyed, or said in another way, religious experience is no longer possible. So that was just a thought I had, again, in connection with a conversation I think everyone here was present at before. So just curious if anyone has thoughts on that question.
Alex.
Hannes, I feel like you're in the best position to answer this question.
I'm happy to hear your thoughts first.
I'll just say my thoughts are now constrained. I couldn't pay attention as well as I wanted to Tom's question, because I was so confused that there was a second David Levy who was saying things very similar to the David Levy I know.
Thank you.
and I just thought maybe he was a little sick or something. His voice sounded different. Yeah, I don't have thought. I am compelled by your sort of. It does seem like the symposium is an interesting locus for these two approaches, and it's interesting. I think that the natural theology approach is sort of comes before the dialectical examination of justice. Not the approach, but it's suggested.
Yes.
But I mean, it's everything is so sketchy there, right? It's like a guideline, unfilled out guideline for an education where you want to do this first, and then you'll want to do that, and it's not clear how these things are supposed to fit together in an actual sort of approach to this question. But that's a very compelling way to look at it.
There is one note this is on page 195 of Leo Strauss on religion. Eros equals maternal instinct, no natural inclination towards moral virtue. The CF Eros on Phronesis. No, that's not the same as Eros of virtue, Strauss says. Xenophon on hunting, and then CF, I think, was contrast, Thomas Aquinas. So yeah, I mean that's difficult, but and that, I think, in a way that Yeah, I don't think Strauss would say that the maternal instinct is the foundation of philosophy but so it's somehow you have several things going on, but nevertheless he wants to also say that there's no eros for moral virtue, and if purity of heart or moral virtue is something essential or indispensable to love of God, but maybe it isn't. I don't know. That's what previous panel was discussing. Then it loses that support. Not that it goes over to philosophy, right? Either. I don't know what is it then? Who's left? Who has this ordinary human being? I mean, if it's not. I mean, this is a very cryptic, admittedly, a very cryptic, because this is something that's written in by hand in Strauss as a note at the bottom of this letter. But maternal instinct, obviously, you prefer your child. You're not, even though the neighbor's child is faster and better at math, you still prefer your child, right? So this shows that it's not real love of virtue. But if speed and intelligence are truly virtues, why wouldn't there be love of that in the right soul? Anyway, but the fact that he mentions Aquinas there shows you that he has that in mind.
Yeah. I'll just add one thing before handing it over to Rasoul. Rasoul, if you want to add something, or I also see that Rana wants to ask another question, and we should bring her back in a second. But I'll add one thing. I mean, what is interesting in both Plato and Strauss's interpretation of Plato on this question that we've been discussing is that there's sort of he investigates this theological, philosophical question primarily in some respects, or most explicitly, in two dialogues which both have deficiencies, right? The Symposium investigates the god Eros, who is sort of, as Strauss once puts it, a little god, right? You wonder sort of, is this the proper subject for investigating the question, what is a god, or thinking about this natural theological question. And in the Euthyphro, which I take, and I think Strauss takes as a very important cross pathway between the two approaches to this question, the approach of natural theology and the question of the dialectical investigation of the nature of justice. You have someone in Euthyphro who's clearly attached to a notion of justice, but I think we can all agree imperfectly, and someone who's also claims to have had religious experiences, but is also kind of a fool, and you would wonder whether there's a quote unquote prophet that the poet Plato could have imagined, who might have been a philosophically more adequate partner for this specific dialogue. But last point on this, I think I very much agree with Eric Buzetti that the two approaches cannot be kept perfectly apart. And I don't think that was... yes, I think that's what both the Symposium and the Euthyphro show. Rasoul, do you want to add something?
Yes, add something and ask for some clarification, because I think it came up in Zarko's comment too, that perhaps it is somehow, this praise of Eros is somehow related to critique of religion as well. That there is some kind of conflict between religion and Eros. You pointed, I think, Zarko, to the conflict between moral virtue and Eros, and well, usually religion is on the side of moral virtue. Does this mean that there is some kind of conflict between religion and Eros as well, or not? And just reminded me of a passage that is, I mean, I don't know if it is helpful at all. There is a just passing remark in Strauss's Notes on Arabian Nights, and I'm going to read it for you. It's so direct. He says, God is jealous, either because he is not or does not believe himself to be infinitely attractive. And the reason for that is his hiddenness. So his hiddenness, I think he's pointing toward his lack of body, probably, but also attributing at least jealousy of biblical God to the question of that he's not perhaps very attractive or he's not beautiful. So perhaps this praise of beauty has something to do with critique of religion as well. So I was thinking, what do you think about this? Is it somehow related, or you think it's not, especially when it comes to the subject of our book, right? Leo Strauss on religion. Do you think that is a critique of revealed religion somehow?
This is more of a question for me.
Yeah, I think, and you, Alex, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, if there is a depends where it's pointing to. One, I mean, I was discussing this with a friend recently, whether there's eros in the Garden of Eden, and I would say there's certainly eros in Eve, because she finds the fruit so attractive, and now that you can say is prohibited or cut down, and then we go right back to where we were in the Euthyphro panel. But do you want to deny altogether the imitation of God? Because the proud, rebellious act by Eve is presented, I don't know, as for the sake of being like God, i.e., God is something good. It's not as if you have the Agathon critique or the Aristophanes critique, for that matter, where he says Zeus doesn't even exist. Who are gods? It's not even attractive. I wouldn't want to be like this God. Right? That's an even more fundamental critique. But it's, no, I want to be like this God. I want to know good and evil like this God. Maybe one day I'll be mature enough to know it. So then eros will be transmuted or sublimated in that direction, and the Bible will be able to reconcile it. So there are. I mean, there are such thoughts. Now you can say that eros disobeys the law, and the Bible is about divine law, and eros is such as transgressive of law. Or, yeah, then you have that. But can you? I mean, all these things are very complicated, and can you sublimate it in such a way that eventually you embrace the biblical God properly understood? Now you can be modifying things in both directions. Philosophic eros can be modified in some way, and then you can read the Bible esoterically to make God, as Strauss says to Paul Krauss, Sharia is to philosophize.
Any other questions or any other additions at this point from Alex, Rasoul, potentially Tom on this point? I don't think so. I'll bring Rana back in, and I'll just say that Stuart Warner asked a question that Rana and Alex and Zarko are probably able to answer. Stuart asked, it would be nice to know from Rana and Zarko and Alex whether Bernadette agreed with Strauss on the tragedy-comedy dynamic. But Rana, maybe you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, I got too
Make
many
your
now.
comments.
You guys are too stimulating here. let's see, one thing taking off from Rasoul, I would think you approach the question of religion and eros. We have to go back to the punitive gods versus the beautiful gods. And I think Strauss and Benedetti agreed these are rooted in the psychology of eros and thumos. But one question I have two questions from the moment. One is, Strauss is rightly, I think, emphasizing the distinction or let's say, the rivalry between one's own and the beautiful, right? Aristophanes representing one's own and Agathon the beautiful, and Socrates is somehow transcending that. But I'm kind of curious what you guys think about translating one's own so quickly into the punitive gods. He sort of does it through patriotism, and I don't know, that bothers me a little bit. I'm not sure I want to move so quickly from one's own to punitive gods. So that's one question I have for everyone. The other thing about leaving eros behind, does Strauss ever say anything about the sort of shocking end of the Diotima speech, which is, yeah, she seems to have totally lost eros for contemplation. And the last words, though, to Socrates, if you only, gave up your attention to the beautiful boys, and you could contemplate and be together with the beautiful itself. Somehow she, in the very last words, has to bring eros back in kind of putting down Socrates' love of living beings. I just wonder, it's so shocking. Where did being together, what does it mean to be together with the beautiful itself, which should have been the pure object of contemplation? Does Strauss comment on that? I can't remember, either in the book or in the transcript or in the notes. Anyway, and oh, Stuart, we can come back to that too. I better leave that for the moment. Too much.
Actually, can you just say why you have a difficulty with there's a letter to, I quote a letter to Harry Jaffa, maybe, but not only to Jaffa, he would say that. That love of one's own leads to the city, leads to justice, and hence to the demand for avenging gods. Is there something wrong with this line of reasoning?
Can I respond?
Yes, there was a question to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm not sure how many sources and roots of this point I could bring up, but it looks like one's own incorporates the dichotomy between punitive and erotic, or thumatic and erotic. There's an erotic love, I would put it. There's an erotic love of one's own, and there's a thumatic love of one's own. And yeah, maybe I just leave that formula out there for now.
That's good. Yeah. And what is it? So what is the second question about how to be with the beautiful? Contemplate.
She doesn't really leave eros behind in the end.
I think to flesh out Rana's point, Diotima defines eros as seeing and being with, and it then becomes a kind of contemplation. I wish I had my copy with that. I've noted all of these, but at the end, it's being with again.
Yeah.
And so while you don't get eros mentioned, you get the formula for eros mentioned, which might be significant that she does.
And right in the context of putting down Socrates' meager love of other living human beings, and rather than the beautiful itself. I mean, the big question you guys are raising about whether philosophy is erotic or eros is left behind, it looks like in the end Plato is criticizing Diotima for leaving eros behind.
It's interesting. On the thumos eros and one's own, that's interesting. The two relationships to one's own. I mean, and now I'm just thinking about just in my own thoughts on the Republic, how Socrates says that thumos, spiritedness, is willing to do anything, right? To sacrifice anything, including yourself. So there's already a kind of detachment from one's own body and defending one's body that then seems to be co-opted by the poets through a moral education for the noble or beautiful things, which Socrates says, this is eros, shot through with eros, right? So it does seem like the more you try to distinguish eros and thumos in their objects, the more they start to kind of sneak in. Precisely because I think you need the thumatic kind of spirited abstraction of which Benedetti makes so much in his book, in order to get this erotic reattachment, right, towards this higher moral exemplar.
And I just say very quickly, I mean, there is something confusing about this because I'll put it through Kruger. I don't know if I can even show Kruger for a second. He attacks Eros because it's too worldly. You cannot get to God through Eros. I mean, of course, Kruger is not, but it's justified because Strauss talks about Kruger a lot in this course, and it's even more in the notes. You have passages and so on. So it's a worldly power, and you need, in fact, you need grace. You cannot do it through Eros. But what's strange then, and it's confusing, is that then if Strauss also says, yeah, I'm not so big on Eros either, philosophy. That's the kind of the confusion. And then who is big on Eros? But yeah, I think there's some very good passages. I mean, unfortunately, it's not been hasn't been translated, but in Kruger's book, it should definitely be translated, right? It is not. Now, what is the reason for calling it a worldly power, rather than at least what Diotima says on the surface? That's the official teaching. It's not a worldly, it's a strange in-between realm. So therefore it can be a ferry or a conveyor to God. But Kruger doesn't want that help. He's not so easily flattered. He's not one of those who are easily flattered and will take any kind of reference and say, "Oh yeah, I accept that." No, he's very firm about it, that he doesn't want Eros will not lead to his Christian God. Whereas it sounds like Strauss thinks it would, so that's why you have to get off the train.
If Alex, Rasoul, or Rana want to add something to this line of argument, now would be the time. If not, I will bring in Alan in a second. But just as a transition, David Levy, the wrong David Levy, asked in the chat a question that sort of gives one of you a moment to think about, or finish up this portion of our discussion. Isn't one of Alcibiades's fundamental dissatisfactions with Socrates that Socrates doesn't really love him or other human beings? I think maybe Alex, you can take that, and Alan, I will allow you to come in and ask your question as soon as Alex is finished.
I think that's actually one of his great satisfactions with Socrates. I think Alcibiades is, completely consumed with a dissatisfaction with himself. And he's surrounded by lovers, and then he encounters this ugly, poor guy who seems to offer him nothing. But what does he offer him? He doesn't give in to his charms, and it really plays into it. I think this also helps address Amy Nenzak's a very good question about whether Strauss had any insights to offer into the character of Alcibiades' violations against the Eleusinian mystery cults, and how this bears on Socrates' impact on politics and piety. I think Strauss, through his relation to his students, I do think there's some remarks in Strauss about Alcibiades' later political career. And then there's a very pregnant remark at the end of Benedetti's essay that I think is building off of this, that's worth thinking about. That it seems like Alcibiades is completely wild and overly ambitious, but it seems like that's already there from Athens. And that eventually, after Athens turns on him, he wins Athens over to a course of moderation when he finally comes back. So, and Benedetti claims, and I think rightly, that this was Socrates' true influence, right? This beautification of moderation, which Alcibiades could find nowhere else in Athens but through Socrates. So, yeah.
Okay, Alan, please unmute yourself, and you have the honor of asking potentially the last question because we're almost at the end of our event.
I believe that I have unmuted myself.
You have. Wonderful.
Okay, good. First, I want to applaud this wonderful panel, and I don't want to throw a monkey wrench into the proceedings, but it seems to me, if I can amplify the image of the monkey wrench, that there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is the question: what is philosophy? And I certainly don't want to introduce that as such an open question, but to narrow it to the question of what the panelists understand Strauss to understand by philosophy. Because unless that question can be answered, it's not clear to me that the panelists are all talking about the same thing or the same Strauss.
Well, that is a fantastic question. Thank you, Alan. And we'll use this as an opportunity to do a little bit of a lightning rod final question. And we'll start with Rasoul, who started the event today, and then move to Zarko. And Alex, you will get the last word.
It's very difficult, to answer this question. There is a lot of debate about whether Strauss subscribed to a zetetic view of philosophy and how does it sit with his specific views that, for instance, he believed every philosophy somehow presupposes the rejection of religion and revelation. That doesn't seem to be very zetetic. So it really depends. It really depends how you understand Strauss. But yes, if you subscribe to the zetetic view of him, you would say that, Strauss believed that this conflict between reason and revelation is something constant in the human mind and human history. It's going to continue forever. But if you subscribe to some rephrased or revised version of it, you should say that he believed philosophy is an activity that is founded on rejection of any kind of authority outside of reason, and that would include revelation. So yeah, that's a big answer that is not perhaps very helpful, but I thought that might be worth bringing it up.
The strict thing would be to see what whether he defines it, but it is a very nice point, because to notice that we are not, now you don't have to have a dictionary definition, that might be kind of silly. It's an inquiry into what's important. It's a kind of love of truth and honesty, but honesty is not sufficient. And then it's an inquiry of what's important, what you regard as important. And if you don't know how to establish what's important, then you suspend judgment. And that has big consequences, because then you don't cry about it because you're not sure if it's really important. So it's, I guess that's zetetic, but I think if you inquire, I think there's a line, maybe it's page 5 of the Symposium transcript. If you cannot determine that something is true or important, and if you're very honest and very passionately in love with the truth, that has a monumental effect on your attachment to the thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure we were ignoring the 800-pound gorilla, though maybe it looked like that because we were picking fleas out of its back, stuck them in its hair. I think and maybe to return to your metaphor, maybe we were doing so poorly with a monkey wrench. But It seems to me like what we've been addressing is the question of whether the relationship between philosophy and eros, and the degree to which they overlap. It seems like, at least in the Symposium, love of the good is identified with the surest path to happiness, according to the young Socrates' reception of Diotima's argument. And the question of how and whether love of the beautiful, or eros, gets reincorporated into that in the ladder of love, the question we were debating not that long ago. And the relationship between philosophy, tragedy, and comedy is all part and parcel of how this question emerges in the course of the Symposium, and really helpfully by virtue of Strauss's sort of magisterial interpretation of it. But how we get back to a characterization of philosophy is very difficult. Yeah.
Yes. Well, before I thank everybody, let me just sort of add my own 25 cents to this question. I mean, Strauss famously claimed that the question quid sit Deus is coeval with philosophy. And I think approaching this question through the questions that we've discussed today, and many questions that we raised today, and many questions that the audience raised and that we did not manage to incorporate into our 2-hour discussion, lead up to this huge problem that Alan just introduced. Let me conclude by thanking the panel and also the many participants. This was a lot of fun, and I'm very grateful that we got together and did this. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
To be continued.